This is Research Like a Pro, episode 195, Texas Land Grants Mexican Era. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hi, Diana, and hi to all our listeners.
Hi, Nicole. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you, and what have you been working on?
Well, I just finished up a client project, and it was so fun to have everything finally come together in the report. This was a project set in Texas, which is appropriate since we're talking about Texas land today, and I did a lot of work in the land records and the tax records. Tax records, I think, as you know, because you've done projects in Texas too, are so great. Texas did a lot of taxing to fund their new statehood. And yeah, this project was trying to figure out when the ancestor, Edley King, arrived in Texas because the client was interested in applying for the Lineage Society if you have an ancestor who arrived before February 1846. So you could be the Republic of Texas Lineage Society. I think its daughter's the Republic of Texas. Anyway, and there was some conflicting evidence about when he actually arrived. And so my job was to try to find records that would figure that out. And it was through taxes that really pinpointed him because he was there in 1850 in the census, but I ended up finding him in the 1847 Nacogdoches census. Texas did a state census, and there's only one that survives, and it just so happens that Edley was in the one that survived, which was exciting. And so he was there by 1847, and then I wanted to see if he had been there by 1846, and searching the tax records for that same area, he didn't arrive until 1847. So taxes were great. And then the other thing that was fun with this project was the client had said that the family still owned the land that he had purchased or was granted or something. And so I, of course, dove into the Texas land grants to see if I could find evidence of his land, and I could not find him in the Texas land grants. So I started following the taxes year by year. He ends up in Kaufman County, and I just year by year found him in the taxes, and then boom, 1862, he finally has land on his taxes, and it's land that was originally granted to a Juan Gonzalez. So in the taxes, they always put who the original grantee was for the land, which is sort of fabulous. But then I couldn't find him in the deeds. So, I mean, this was just kind of an interesting, elusive ancestor. And I finally extended out the deed search way past that and found him in the deeds not until 1889. So apparently the family didn't get deeds recorded until it was time to transfer that land to his grandson or his granddaughter's husband. So isn't that interesting? It was so puzzling trying to figure out the whole story of the land. Anyway, I figured out that he did not arrive by the Republic era, but we did get a lot of information on him.
Those Texas tax records are so detailed. It's wonderful that they list the original grantee. And I've seen that before and thought, I wonder how I could use this information. How is this going to help me? And you made a good point that looking for that original grantor in the deeds could help you see, when he transferred it to the owner that currently has it. But that's interesting that it wasn't really recorded until later. And that happens sometimes. I've seen that in New York as well, where deeds just weren't recorded and that early time period, and then you'll find them transferring the land to someone else later, but you don't see the original deed when they got it.
Exactly. And, the value of knowing who the original grantor was or grantee was you can go to those Texas land grants, which we're talking all about in this series. And those are great because they have little maps of the original surveys and they give the whole description. They give so much information about the land. And then the Texas General Land Office website, if you put in the original abstract number, it will show you. They have maps already created for you, and you can look at that land in a variety of ways. It's an amazing feature. So if you use the taxes to find the original person who was granted the land, then you can go find it on a map. So I'll be sharing a little bit of that with our ancestor in the next episode about Texas land grants. It's a fun record set to work with.
Well, it sounds like you were successful in your client project, and that's really great that you were able to get the answers that the client needed, although it sounds like they were hoping to join a society which they can't join now.
Right. But, it sometimes just knowing is really helpful. And I was able to find a picture of the ancestor. His name was Edley King, and he was a Confederate veteran, and they had had a reunion in 1880, I believe. And so I found pictures that others had posted online of him on his horse and a newspaper article. And so it was fun to find some additional information about Edley.
Well, I was working on some tax records last night because I'm tracing forward some of Bathsheba Tharp's cousins and things because I used DNA in her proof argument of her father. And so I was just kind of wrapping that up and making sure I had all those parent child links proven. And there's one parent child link where George Tharp goes out to Kentucky that doesn't have a will or probate that I could find in Henry County or Carroll County or anywhere there where he lived. But there were tax records, and the tax records showed him by himself at first, and then there was like another George Tharp, and in one of the tax records it lists him as a junior, which doesn't mean they were father son, but it, at least shows me there was a difference of age. Anyway, eventually, several of George's sons showed up on the tax records throughout the years, and they were the only Tharp family that I could find living in that county. So it provided a lot of indirect evidence of a familial relationship, which is always super helpful when you don't have anything else.
Oh, that's great. And I love it when the younger sons start showing up because they finally turned 18 or 21, depending
21
on
in
the
this case. Yes.
laws. It's so great because then you can give them an estimated birth year. So tax records are fabulous.
Yes. Well, announcements today. We're preparing for NGS conference. So the National Genealogical Society conference will be on May 24th through 28th in Sacramento. We'll be attending there, and parts of the conference will also be virtual. So we hope to see you, whether it's virtually or in person. We'll have a booth and we'll be giving some classes. So we look forward to this conference every year. It's a wonderful way to learn more about research techniques and localities.
Right. NGS is so fun. And one of my favorite things is to purchase the package where you get the audio and then you can listen to the talks all year long. And I love listening to talks about areas that I have not researched before. Something that's totally different and new to me. I just think it's fascinating to hear how other people use the records in a different area or how they solve a problem. So, if you want to listen to great material all year long, that's a fun thing to do as well.
Agreed. Today, we get to talk about Texas land grants, like Diana had mentioned. So, we will focus on the Mexican era. So, if you have an ancestor who came into what is now Texas in the 17 or 1800s, it's really helpful for you to understand how these different eras happened and who was in charge, the history, the jurisdictions, and then, of course, the records that were created. So, we've already talked about beginning parts of Texas where we explored Spanish, and today we'll do Mexican. Next will be Republic, and then the statehood eras of Texas. And we're specifically focusing on the land grants. Today we're going to talk about the era of Mexican rule over Texas and the Mexican colonization policy that happened through the Empresario system. So we'll look at the types of records created and where to find them.
So, this is kind of a short period of time. The Mexican era is 1821, when Mexico declared themselves independent of Spain, which was 1821, and it goes until 1836 when Texas declared itself independent of Mexico, and that was the beginning of the Republic. So it's a short period of time, but during this, there are a lot of people that poured into Texas under these empresarios. And the first one is Moses Austin. And he had obtained permission from the Spanish government right before the revolution and Mexico took over. He had obtained this permission to establish a colony, and he was deemed an impresario. And then he promptly died, but his son, Stephen F. Austin, took over, and he would then see the colony through. So, why was this whole system brought into play? Well, Mexico wanted a buffer between the United States and its westward expansion policies. And they also had problems with the Native American tribes there that were, well, obviously, they're not happy that settlers are coming in and taking their hunting grounds and their lands and settling. And so they kept this impresario system that Spain had started, and then they gave it a lot of incentives so people would come and settle. And so impresarios would try to engage people from in the United States to come and settle in Texas. And so the first one, as I mentioned, is Austin's colony. And he had obtained permission to bring 300 families to the Brazos River region of Texas. So 300 families is pretty significant considering, they bring husbands, wives, and children. And there could be a lot of descendants that have ancestry that goes back to Moses Austin's colony. There is a wonderful collection at the Texas General Land Office Archives, and it is titled Austin's Colony Records. It is a huge collection, so if you have an ancestor that's indexed as one of the colonists, then of course you would want to go to the General Land Office or order, the records for your specific person and see what you could get. They have contracts, land titles, correspondence. These types of manuscript collections, you just never know what you're going to get on your ancestor. And they are from 1823 to 1841 is the range of dates, but most of them are between 1825 and 1835. So if you have an early Texas ancestor and you suspect or find them in the index under Austin's colony, just know there is a lot of great stuff that could be waiting for you. But first, you have to find them in the index.
Yeah, let's talk about the index. But before we do, I just wanted to say I've always wondered what does empresario translate to? And so I looked it up. It translates to businessman, and I think the general meaning of it is land agent, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right. Well, these indexes for the Austin colony records are online and they name the head of household, their age, and the state of emigration and the household information. One of the indexes is a digital image of the original register created by Stephen F. Austin, and this is hosted on the GLO website. And the next two are copies of the original register. So all three should be consulted for an ancestor for best results. One of the indexes is by George Glass, and it retains the original format and has additional notes inserted. And then there's an index called Williams Index, which retains the original format and is translated from the original Spanish into English.
Right. So when I first was learning about this, I was so curious as to why there would be three different indexes and why you couldn't just use one. And so I decided to do a little test on just a random person because I don't have any ancestors in this colony. So I chose James Beardsley in all three indexes, and it can show why you would want to use each one. So, first of all, the original Register of Families, it is indexed on the Texas General Land Office website. So you can just put in your ancestor's name and it'll bring up the indexed record and a link to the PDF version of the original Register of Families. So the index data is complete. It's translated from Spanish into English, but the only thing with it is it's not in the context of the original index. And oftentimes we want to have things in context to know who was listed before or after in case they were coming as a group and that's how they were entered. But it gets you started so you can get the basic information. So we find that James Beardsley was 50 years old. He was married. He had three sons, three daughters. He was He was a farmer. He had no slaves. He originated from New Jersey. Isn't that interesting?
Hmm.
I think sometimes we always think it's just the Southerners that came in because our family were all Southerners that came into Texas. And he arrived in February of 1830. He took an oath on February 16th, 1830, and he's in Austin's colony in volume one. So, I mean, that index gives you some pretty good details. That's awesome. And it also gives the name of his wife, which was Hester. That in and of itself is great. And maybe you have used that and just went on your merry way going, oh, I found so much information. That was awesome. But just know there's a PDF, and when you click on that, it takes you to the digitized image of that entire register. And it's always fun to look at the original. Just know that the names are written in English, so you can, that's nice. You can pick out your ancestor's name and the state of origin, but other details are in Spanish. So, you've got to know what they're asking and see if you can figure out what's going on. Or you can use one of the other indexes. So the second index is one that I think is fascinating. This is titled Index to Land Applications, and this is the one compiled by George Glass. And he's basically taken the original and he has added some notes to it. So he's got some brackets showing his own notes, and he gives some details about the final land grants. So he's done some extra research and put that into the index, which is really interesting. So going back to our James Beardsley, for this index, we see the same information, James Beardsley, we see Hester, we see he's from New Jersey, but then there's in brackets this little notation that he received his grant on March 31st, 1831. He received 1 league of land, and it's 3/4 in Fayette County and 1/4 in Washington County. So, how neat is that? You get this little extra tidbit about James Beardsley. So, George Glass did that index, and it's handwritten. It's on, looks like notebook paper. And I just think it's fascinating to compare the two. And then finally, we have a third index, and this one is actually available on Ancestry. So you may have had a record come up as a hint for one of your ancestors on Ancestry through this index. And this one is the one by Villa Mae Williams. It's typed and it is actually translated from the Spanish. So we get all the information, and a few of those little terms that look tricky on the original are translated into English. Very easy to use and understand, but it doesn't give those extra notes that George Glass put in the brackets. Villa Mae's register also has an introduction with a map, a timeline, and definition of Spanish terms, so it teaches you more about the actual records. I think it's really valuable to consult all three.
Absolutely. And make sure you look at Diana's blog post too, because she has screenshots showing what each of these look like. And it's fun to see.
Both the George Glass and the Villa Mae Williams do keep James Beardsley in context. So we do get to see the order of his. I don't know if they would be neighbors or if they were just people that came in at the same time, but studying the context of the record is very valuable. So they are great indexes.
Yeah, it helps to see that they came from different places. The people all around James Beardsley came from Alabama and Arkansas, but the family right above him, both of them, like the two lines above him, all came from Alabama. So maybe they were coming, as a group or were related to each other or something. So that could kind of help you sort that.
Right. And I also love that they have the name of the wife on every one of those. They have Mary the wife, Hester the wife, another Mary. That's great. Well, and one of the entries right above James Beardsley is for Andrew Robinson. And there's a note under his that says he wants his land on Buffalo Bayou below and together with Price. So that's interesting because that's connecting him to another person. And then you could go find that individual, whoever Price is, and try to figure out how they're connected.
All right, great. Well, let's learn more about the Empresario system now. So this offered many incentives for settlers. So, with the Mexican laws being favorable to settlers, Americans really started pouring into Texas from 1821 to 1836, and soon they outnumbered the Mexican settlers. So, after Austin's colony, other empresarios had to wait until 1825 to start their colonies because there was that change going on from Spanish to Mexican rule, and they were working on passing all these colonization laws. So, if you find your ancestor receiving land through any of the empresario colonies, you might want to research the circumstances thoroughly because there might have been controversies with neighboring colonies and land speculation and people going in and just doing things without the help of the law. So just check into
Imagine
that.
that.
So from 1823 to 1830, Mexico established this colonization policy, providing land for immigrants to settle under these different colonies. And each colony had its own land office. All that families had to do was come in, pay a small fee, and then they could obtain as much as a league of grazing land, which is equivalent to 4,400 acres, about, and a labor of cropland, which is about 177 acres. So this was like a huge incentive. They could get a lot of land. And if a settler did not use the assistance of an impresario, he would receive an additional labor of land. So that's interesting. An abstract of the original titles of records in the Texas General Land Office will name all this information. It will name the settler, the date of the title, and the description and quantity of land granted by league and labor. This digitized book groups the colonists by colony or commissioner and are typically alphabetically arranged. So when I was researching for a client who actually did settle during this time period, had an ancestor who did, I was reading through all these land records, talking about leagues and labors and trying to figure out how many acres that was. So it's definitely different to look at land measured in a different way. The following list of Empresario system incentives kind of shows us the draw that this land would have had for our ancestors. So, like I said, one league for grazing was 4,400 acres, one labor for farming, which is 177 acres, and then 2 years to settle on the land after receiving the title. And here's a big one: you're exempt from taxes for 6 years. You can pay half the regular taxes for the next 6 years. And after 3 years, married settlers automatically became naturalized citizens of Mexico. And the impresario received free land within the colony and could collect fees from the colonists. So that was kind of their reason for wanting to do this. They also allowed settlers to bring slaves into the colony, which was an incentive for anyone coming from the southern states who wanted to bring their slaves with them.
Well, you get so much information just from reading why they would come in, not having to pay the taxes. And you can imagine how great that would be, especially if you're having so much land. You kind of wonder how much they'd be taxed for later on with 4,400 acres of land, right?
Yeah, I wonder how much the taxes were. Have to go look.
Yeah, right. So that was a huge incentive, the impresarios. I mean, why would they go do that? Well, of course, they're going to have a kickback. Well, you might be wondering, this is all great, but where do you find these records? The Texas General Land Office Archives, they have a whole collection called the Spanish Collection, and they have details of every impresario colony, kind of those manuscript collections that I talked about with the Austin collection. They'll have that for each of the different colonies, and you'll get maps, records, legal documents, anything connected to that. The website also will give you some historical information and give you a brief description of the colony. So the Texas General Land Office has tried to really bring everything together and make it pretty easy for us to understand. Now, one of the interesting records that was created in conjunction with these land grants was the character certificate required to obtain the land. So we're just going to look at an example of that. I certainly wish that all of our ancestors who got land had to fill out a character certificate. Wouldn't that be so fun?
It'll be interesting to see, but probably some of them wouldn't have qualified, I guess.
That could be true because you think, why did they do this? Well, Mexico was trying to settle this land with people of good character. So the Ancestry.com has indexed and digitized the book, and the title is Character Certificates in the General Land Office of Texas. So if you saw that come through as a hint for an ancestor and really didn't know what it was all about, you were supposed to fill that out and you know, talk about how you were going to be a good citizen, I guess. So here's an example, though, that I think is so fascinating. There are women mentioned in these land records. And so we've got Margaret Russell. This is October 2nd, 1835, and her certificate is saying that she is a widow of James Russell, a native of Virginia. They immigrated in 1833. She's a lady of the family of 4 persons, and she took the oath. Wow, so that's really great that we get the information about when they came in and who her husband was. These are just great. You just never know what you're going to get in these types of records. One of them for Juan Ryan is saying that he is a certified foreigner and a man of good dot dot dot. So I'm guessing that's going to be a man of good character. And he's single without a family. So fun records.
Yes, I have some experience with these character certificates. I had one that wasn't translated, so I had to try to translate it from Spanish, but then it was difficult, so I got some help. And even the person I asked for help was struggling with some of the uh, sort of antiquated language. And so I actually asked the Texas General Land Office to help translate it, and they already had it translated. So they sent it to me for free. It was great.
That is awesome. So if you find that your person in the index, you contact the Texas General Land Office and you can get the entire file there because the index, has these dot dot dots, doesn't give you everything. So you want to get the original. And how great that they translated it for you.
Yeah, I never even used the index. I had just gone straight to the General Land Office and typed in the name, and it came up as a digital file of the original in Spanish. And so I was just kind of learning as I went. And yeah, later I found that index and I was like, oh, this is what it says.
That's great. You just went backwards. And
Yeah,
that,
but the thing that was really helpful about this character certificate in my research project was that it listed the person's wife by name and how many children he brought with him, which was excellent. It really helped figure out if it was the right guy.
yes, I was going to say that would be so good to let you know if there are people of the same name coming in that you have the right one.
Well, cool. Thanks for sharing about those character certificates. All right, let's talk now about De Leon's colony in 1824. This was the only predominantly Mexican colony in Texas. And De Leon petitioned the Mexican government for permission to settle 41 Mexican families of good moral character. So he was a prominent Mexican citizen, and he was given wider latitude than the foreign empresarios. A few Anglo settlers did join some of these Mexican families, but they were mostly Mexican families from Tamaulipas, and they settled on the Guadalupe River. So the Texas General Land Office holds the original records for each colony, and the website will give important information on the record collection about the historical context, the scope, the contents, the arrangement, and the index terms. So when you're searching for these, you can read those. And you'll also be able to see if the materials have been digitized. You can just search by your ancestor's name and view the PDF, and these records will be in Spanish. So, for an example of this type of record, Jose Antonio Saucedo, he received a title to the town tract of San Patricio de Hibernia. In Diana's blog post, she has a great image of what this looks like. And this is very similar to the grant that I was working on and also needed to translate along with the character certificate. so so once again, I asked the Texas General Land Office to help with that, and they said they would translate it for a fee, and it was per word. I think it was the character certificate that wasn't translated, and it was the grant that they had already translated for me. So that one they sent for free, but the certificate they wanted me to pay to have it translated per word. And so I worked on it with another person who spoke Spanish. But anyway, these are really beautiful records and they're digitized in color. So you can see kind of how they look. They're kind of yellowed over from the years and the ink is kind of brownish black. So it's a really good original record.
They are beautiful. I used this section of De Leon's colony in a project for a client who was trying to trace land that the story in the family was the ancestor had received land from the King of Spain. And I found a possible candidate with the name, kind of the family name, in this colony. And of course, there was a big gap from when he would have received the land, about 1830, up to where I had traced the family in Mexico, which was 1880. So,
Ooh,
there's a big gap there trying
yeah.
to see if this is really the right ancestor that received land in Texas as part of this Mexican colony. But it made sense in the context of the history and what was happening that that could have been the case. So, that just more research that needs to be done there. So let's talk about the results of this colonization policy in Texas. And on the blog post, I do have a map that shows what it looks like and has in color a different color for each of the colonies. This map is called the Map of Coahuila and Texas in 1833. And in 1833, the settlement was from the Gulf Coast, north and west. And we already have Indian Territory blocked off, which becomes Oklahoma. That had been established by 1833, and the five civilized tribes were in the middle of that removal from their southeastern homes. So that can kind of put this all into context of history. You've got the five civilized tribes coming over, and we often hear that called the Trail of Tears. It was a very tragic and sad time for those tribes. And then at the same time, they're going up into Indian Territory, and then the flood of Americans are coming into Texas. And so by 1835, we have 30,000 Americans estimated to be living in this region. And most of them did come from the southeastern United States. You saw that we had our New Jersey guy, but then above and below him were Arkansas and Alabama. And when you look at the censuses and the records, you do see it's mostly the Southeast because they can grow the same types of crops. This is the same type of climate that they're used to. So that's what we're seeing. And one of the challenges was that, of course, a lot of them had slaves and they're bringing their enslaved people with them. And so they did establish a culture of slavery in Texas that would persist until emancipation. And most of these settlers were Protestant, but when they came into the area under Mexico, they had to swear an oath of Catholicism to own land. So you'll do anything to get your land, apparently, even say you're going to change your religion, which I think is very interesting.
So it's interesting how the end of Mexican rule concluded in Texas. So in April of 1830, the Mexican Congress passed a law prohibiting further immigration from the US into Texas, and they canceled all Empresario contracts, with only Austin and DeWitt getting permission to continue. So, if you can imagine, many of the settlers who had come from the States were angered because they wanted more of their family members and friends to come and join them in Texas. One of the problems was land speculation, and the Revolution of 1836 kind of resulted in the formation of this new free place called the Republic of Texas. And a new era of settlement began. And once Texas gained independence from Mexico, the first Congress of the Republic defined the boundaries of the Republic and required all the previous land transactions to be submitted to their new General Land Office. And so they were trying to fix this problem of transferring all the land ownership that was under Mexican rule to the new Republic of Texas and figuring out who owned what. And people were living on the land. Did they own it or were they just squatting on it? So it was kind of like a transition period. The Republic declared all vacant land was now their property. And the Republic also needed to fund a militia in defense against the Native American tribes and the Mexicans. So they were using land as their primary resource. And the government issued these bounty grants to soldiers according to how long they had served in the Army of the Republic. And there were various acts that were passed determining how much land was awarded. So the land was very important for revenue for the Republic, and they took great care to make sure they got those land records from the land offices under Mexico and kept those records in the new Republic and later as the state of Texas. So, because they really took good care of these records, they are a great treasure trove for us as genealogists to be able to see what land was granted and who came and got it and all the things that went along with it. So, although it was kind of a time period where a lot of transitions were going on, the 20s through the 40s, those records survive.
Right. And I think you said it well, that because of the importance of the land, they took such good care of those records. And I think everyone listening can see, if you have an ancestor that came in and there's a land record, there's so much you can do with that to discover, first of all, if it is your ancestor, to help you decide if it is yours and not someone else of the same name, and then just to get more clues for further research. So we are having so much fun talking about Texas land. In our next episode, we will talk about the land grants under the Republic and the state of Texas. And this is probably the era that most of you with Texas ancestors, that your ancestors granted land, because this next era is for a long period of time. So thanks for listening, and we hope you have a great week and go make some great discoveries.
Okay, we'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.